morning, everybody, and welcome to today's session. I'm going to be with you talking about reflective leadership practice, which I hope is what you were hoping to sign up for. My name is Ngozi Aniforo, and I'll be spending some time with you today really thinking about how reflective practice can be enhanced, really through thinking about ourselves as leader, but also the impact on our personal and professional context of our ability to lead. I'm really hoping today's session there's a lot I'll try to cover. I'm hoping it's an opportunity for us to get into a bit of a conversation. It may or may not be possible, but I think it's really a chance for you to have some space to reflect and think. So throughout today, there'll be just pauses. I'll invite you to have moments when you can try and think about what I'm covering and locate it in your own self, your own sort of context, really. So I imagine all of you in one way or another are really dealing with challenging situations on a day-to-day basis. And so really underpinning today's session is the idea that there's something important about how we are able to understand ourselves and our own relationship to the demands of our role. And that's really in order for us to feel that we can nurture our own resilience and our own sense of personal agency. So I hope that feels like something that you want to be thinking about this morning. And I think when I thought about today's session and thinking about what we might cover, it felt like it was really important for us to be able to think about how we're able to lead and support others, particularly during turbulent times or periods of significant change and transition, which I'm sure many of you have experienced and continue to experience. Before I go on, I'm really interested in who's joined me today. So do take the opportunity to get involved in the chat. I'll look out for who's popping up, but I'd like to know something maybe about your role and maybe something you want to take away from today's session. So I'm sure many of you, given your context and the roles that you occupy, are really familiar with the concept of reflective practice. So I'm not starting from a base of you not having any sense of what that means, but I do think it's important to say at this point that in this session, reflective practice has really been thought of not as a fixed concept, but rather a way of building reflection on self and others into our everyday leadership practice. It's being able to think about who you are and how you can use yourself to bring out the best in others, or even galvanise others to act, which is something that can be particularly challenging. And when you're working, as I know many of you are, in increasingly complex systems and facing multiple pressures and demands and resources, that's something that we really have to work hard at. And so I suppose it's an opportunity for you to have that space to think about what can you bring and how can you bring out your best self, but also the best self in others. We're going to have the next hour or so thinking together and hopefully talking together about the concept of reflective leadership practice. And I'll be introducing some ideas and strategies for really enhancing self-reflexivity, thinking about leadership and personal effectiveness. So hopefully that will give you some space to think about that in as we move through the morning. So there's three main themes I thought might be useful to think about in the session. First one, what does it mean to lead? So thinking about concepts of leadership. So there is a huge amount of information out there. So I'll touch on some ideas that I think might be helpful for our context and what we're thinking about today, and inviting you to think about your own relationship to leading others. Then we'll move through to thinking about awareness of self, who you are as a leader and who are you as a leader, and what is it we bring to the role and what shapes us as leaders. So thinking about our own context and our own narratives and how we bring that into our leadership space. And finally, we'll be thinking about how do we adopt a reflective and reflexive approach? And they are different, and I'll talk a little bit about those differences, but exploring those concepts in practice, but also what impact can they have on our leadership practice in general. Towards the end, I will leave some time to have some questions and answers, and that will be a brief opportunity for you to maybe explore any questions you might have. Hopefully you have the chance to capture some of those as we go through. And I do invite you to, if you throw out questions that emerge, you may not want to ask them then, but you may want us to capture them as we move through the session. So please do that as we go through, but there'll be some space at the end just before we finish to think about those. What I will try and do from those questions, I will be checking out as we go through, really pick up any emerging themes. We might not have the chance to follow all the threads, but perhaps, as part of the Q&A session or maybe following up later, I can pick up any burning issues that you might have. So that's what we're going to hopefully cover while we're together. And so if that feels all right, we can move into really thinking about the topic of reflective practice. So what does it mean to lead? And I suppose I love this image because I think it really encapsulates this sense of what leadership might mean, and it might land very differently with each of you. But I think when we think about leadership, what do we actually mean by that term? I think it has a different resonance and it lands very differently with everybody. So just take a moment to think for yourself, when we say leadership, what is that? What do we mean? One of the things that's quite interesting is there are so many ways of defining leadership, a raft of definitions that are out there. And you could almost think of it as a slightly elusive term because there's no single concrete definition. These are a few definitions that, on reflection, I think are quite useful, and I wonder how they land with you. So, for example, motivating people to act is one way of describing leadership. The capacity to translate vision into reality. I don't know how that feels for you, but I think it's quite an interesting way of thinking of what leadership is. And then the last one there is really about the act of leading a group of people or an organisation. And you might feel that all of these apply when you think of your own situation and circumstance. You may think that none of them do, or you may think one or two of them really sort of land with you. I think the thing to pick up at this point is that there are many different ideas about leadership. And therefore, how we approach, how we enhance leadership, or when we think about what is the optimal performance that we're looking for, it varies. And so it's important to think about, we're not getting too locked in a fixed idea of leadership, but actually start to invite us to think about how do we do all these aspects of leadership in very different ways. Different situations call on us to act differently. And so I'm leaving you to think, how would you define it? What words would you use to define leadership that resonates with you and has meaning and purpose for you? I mean, if we unpack it a bit more, it could be argued that to be a leader, what we're talking about is our ability to be able to act into expected behaviours, attitudes and capabilities. For many of you, it may well be something that's reflected in your job role. It could be set out as a set of behaviours and capabilities that are reflected in your job descriptions. It varies between organisations and different contexts. So there's something about how we understand how leadership is understood in an organisational context as well. Some of you will have varying titles and varying positions that will vary from organisation to organisation. So I know even when we're talking in a social work context, being a leader can be understood in many different ways. Often, the ways in which leadership is understood is in a really hierarchical way. But one of the things I always find quite interesting is that leadership can exist at all levels. You might reflect on your teams and the individuals you have or you're leading at the moment and find that there are leadership behaviours being seen all the time across the piece. So sometimes it's trying not to have such a narrow definition, but thinking about the things that we're able to recognise as leadership behaviours in ourselves and in other people. How do we make the most of those? But certainly thinking about the who of the leader. So it's not just about the things we do or the techniques that we use, but essentially what we bring to that leadership role. And so there is a real sense of how do you match the expectations around the behaviours and attitudes and capabilities with the behaviours and attitudes that we bring, our own values, our own sense of who we are, how we act and embody those behaviours and capabilities and attitudes. So there's an opportunity to really think about that when we try to understand what do we mean by leadership. And I appreciate that will feel very different for each and every one of you. I'm not sure if you're all, it'd be useful as well just to hear a bit about where you are in your leadership journey. So are you at the beginning of it? Is it something you've been, in terms of leading others, has it been something you've been doing for a long while? So it just gives me a sense of the variety in this space and the sort of things that we need to think about when we try and conceptualise leadership. So feel free to just let us know a bit more about where you're coming from and what leadership is for you and how it shows itself in terms of your role. So often, and I suppose when I invite you to think about that question, partly what I'm curious about is that we'll often have in our minds an internalised idea of what we mean by leadership. So when we think about what leading others means, this is largely going to be informed by our own experience of being led. So some of you will be able to reflect back on experiences of being led what did you take from that? What did you learn from that? What kind of ideas did you develop about what good leadership looks like? So I suppose it's remembering that we often have a template, and we might not hold that in our minds on a day-to-day basis, but we'll often have a template that's informed by our own experience. So sometimes what we take into our leadership role is our idea of what we experienced as leadership. And sometimes that can be good, and sometimes there might be challenges around the ideas, the behaviours and attitudes that we are bringing in. So sometimes it's something about how we think about, where do those ideas come from? What's our sense of what it means to lead others, and where do we get that from? Good leadership and what that feels like to us can be a very individualized experience. So we might have a theoretical idea of what we think good leadership is, but sometimes when we're too fixed on the theory, we forget to notice and recognize strong leadership behaviors, the things that impact, the things that inspire. And so sometimes we need to think about what do we think good leadership looks like? What are the behaviors that we recognize to be good leadership? And that will vary amongst people. There'll be much that you can read theoretically that tells you that these are behaviors that should show themselves in a good leader. But I think sometimes when we're thinking about how we apply them, we have to think about context. So what effective leadership can do, as we said in the very beginning, is really thinking about, if it's about galvanizing people to act, if it's about really bringing to bear good outcomes, and that may be within the team, it could be for children, young people and families, it could be from an organisational context. It's really understanding that those ideas about what effective leadership is will be informed by those wider narratives, those expectations which will be determined maybe by the organisation, but also they could be within a service area or within a team. And so sometimes we have to think about these ideas we have in our mind about what we think is our internalised view of good leadership. Where is that coming from? The challenge for us may well be, if we are holding ideas that come from our own experience that may jar with what we understand the expectation is within our environment or our context. So sometimes we have to think about and really understand, what do we think is the idea of good leadership, effective leadership, and what it means to lead others. I'm just noticing some of the comments, and thank you for those that have come through. So there's something about leadership being defined by a goal. I'm needing to be able to be clear about leading towards something. And I said something about the individual is just a person with certain characteristics which may be or may not be helpful. And that's quite an interesting kind of reflection, really, because if the goal isn't clear, then it's not necessarily clear what you're leading people towards. And I think the point, just the reflection there about the characteristics being helpful or unhelpful, I think there is something about recognising what does that goal, achieving that goal, require? What are the characteristics or the behaviours and attitudes that particular goal requires? And that may vary. And so I think that's a really useful kind of reflection about how the goal and what the outcome that's desired is, and being clear about that in order to determine what kind of leadership is required to achieve it. So I thank you for that. I think it's a really helpful sort of reflection and worth holding in mind. And please do share more as we move through. Just a bit of reflection for you. I'm quite interested in your ideas about how it feels in leading others. Take a look at some of these images that are just shared there. And I just want to understand, or I'll be interested in, just give you about 20 seconds or so. Have a think about which of the images resonates most with you when you think about yourself leading others in your current role. So there is sort of a range of images there. Just take a few seconds. Maybe we're going to give you a few seconds just to pick a letter which resonates, which shows the image that you think, when you think about yourself in your leadership and leading others, which of those resonate with you? And it could be a challenge, and it may be that however you're feeling, could be how you're feeling today. It may be that you're kind of reflecting quickly on where you are over the course of your leadership, but just be interesting to hear back from you, just a sense of how any of these give you a sense of this is what I feel like in my leadership. And as I said, it could be about on a daily basis, sometimes we feel much more empowered and able and have a sense of agency. Other days we may feel not. But I'll leave you to kind of have a think about what that image feels like. We might return to it and just see whether some interesting things coming through about, so there's something about how we're juggling loads of priorities, responsibilities. There's something about the nurturing that we might feel we have to do in our role. So just a couple more seconds to see if anybody wants to add a bit more. I'm liking the feedback around whether sometimes we feel, we have to show the lion on the outside, but we feel a bit more like a pussycat. But yeah, so I'll give a couple of minutes. So it seems like there's a sort of, from those who've participated, there's an equal spread of those of you who are between D, E and F actually at the moment. There seems to be quite a shared sense of, and I wonder if sometimes that's about how you're feeling today, or whether there's something about all of those things are part and parcel of how we might be feeling. But yeah, we'll return to that, and I'll be interested to see if so we might pop back and see if there's any more contributions to that. But it's interesting to see that D, E and F seem to have equal sense of where people are at when they think about themselves in their leadership. Something about juggling many priorities, needing to be strong on the outside, but also this need to kind of nurture and care for other people. And I wonder sometimes if we often move between those positions. So let's think about leadership a bit more. And I'm just picking up on the comments again that these there's some sense of what bad leadership looks like, which is a really interesting comment, really about when we're not clear in the goal. There's something about the lack of clarity and a lack of decisiveness and decision making that can make it a real challenge. And I think there's something about when you're trying to lead others, being clear about where you're leading them to and being clear about what sort of decisions are required can be a collaboration. It could be something about understanding how do the people you're leading understand what's required of them? What is the direction they're heading towards? So there is something about how we continue to reflect on where we're going, where we're leading people to. So let's think a little bit more about leadership. Having that sense of setting the parameters and deciding where you're going as a goal or direction. I just wanted to reflect with you on this idea about power and the idea that sometimes in a leadership role we are thinking about how powerful, what sort of agency do we have? And I think French and Raven's sort of ideas about power are really useful to reflect on. So I'll just run through some of them quickly. So when they talk about power, they talk about two main categories. So they talk about organisational power, which is really where we have the authority to act. So there's something about where we think about legitimate power, so our ability to influence other people's behaviours because of our position. So where we are in the organisation, or what the organisation has embodied in us as being our authority to act. Reward power, which is essentially how we influence the behaviour of others by providing them with things that they want to receive. So that level of power that we might deploy, which is really trying to tap into the motivation of other people and think about how we might reward and receive more of that positive behaviour and actions from those we're leading. Coercive power is the third aspect of organisational power, which I think is useful to think about, which is where we might, rather than using reward, we're talking about how punishment and a perceived threat of punishment is a way of influencing the behaviour of others. The other two aspects that they talk about fall within what they call personal power. And this is the other aspect of how we're able to influence. Firstly, expert power, which is about how we influence others' behaviour because we've got a range of knowledge, skills and experience and ability that really is recognised, and and because of that recognition is able to shape and influence how people respond and behave. And there's something about that which is about the respect for that understanding and knowledge that we bring. And then reverent power, and that's really an interesting one because that's about how we influence others' behaviour because they actually like us or they respect what we do. And these are sort of, I would never see these as concrete concepts that you only land within using each of these discreetly. Sometimes, I suppose, in their ideas that you move between these spaces. Sometimes you are using more expert power to influence behaviour. Sometimes it might be more coercive because that's what the situation requires. But I think one of the interesting aspects is how these interplay and thinking about how you might utilise or draw on these aspects of power. So, this suggests, Lunenburg suggests that actually, and I don't know what you think about this quote, suggests that a true leader is able to influence people and modify behaviour using a combination of legitimate, which is the power that's been bestowed on you by your organisational context and the position you occupy, and reverent power, how much people like and admire and respect you. And so his suggestion is actually the combination of the two is the most effective way to influence and modify behaviour. I'm not sure what you think. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about that. So I think, can you just reflect on that, and just inviting you to sort of go into your own context. Have there been situations where you think you've been able to influence the actions of others, either in your team or amongst your peers or with partners? What type of power do you think you're exerting? What do you think you were drawing on to be able to do that? So just take a couple of seconds in your head to have a reflection on where you think you were drawing on your power. There's something quite powerful about thinking of those ideas of power, because sometimes one of the challenges when we're reflecting on our leadership practice is not recognising the power that we use and can utilise. And so I suppose part of thinking of this in this session is tapping into how often are you able to really think about what power you have. What power do you exert? It may well be that sometimes in our leadership capacity we're feeling a bit powerless. And this invites us to think, actually, we may feel our legitimate power might be strangled or squeezed because of the organisational situation, but we might forget the other opportunities to draw on power and exert that power. So I suppose from a reflective point of view, it's thinking about what power, capacity of power do you have available to you? And if we just quickly return to those two slides, just to remind you briefly, so just going back a couple of slides, just in terms of the two types of power. So just so that you can hold it in your head, organisational power, which is, as I said, those three: legitimate, reward and coercive, and then personal power, which is more about utilising your knowledge, skills and ability, but also being able to influence because you are respected, admired and liked. And I just want to take you on to this other concept really of power, which is, I suppose, thinking about yourself as a leader and how you draw on those things. But one of the things that I think is quite interesting about this concept that Brené Brown talks about is this grounded leadership. So when we're thinking about ourselves and starting reflecting on our leadership approach, the way that we are, one of the things that she suggests is that actually an aspiration would be to try and be grounded in our leadership. So really thinking about who we are. And her suggestion is that actually we need to be clear in who we are and our identity. What type of leader are we? Who do we think we are and what do we bring? We need, and tapping into that comment before about the goal and direction, we need to be clear about the depth and the scope of the work ahead. So where is it that you're taking people to? Where are you leading? What is the ask? And sometimes I think there's so much pressure to move quickly that we often are challenged about having the space to think about, well, what is the goal? Where are we going? What is the vision for what we're trying to do here? And then she talks about something about within all of that. So when we're thinking about our leadership and how we're leading others towards a goal, what are the moments where we allow ourselves to be vulnerable? So in that aspiration, where do we get the space to think about what we know and what we don't know, and how aware are we of that? So the invitation here is to think, really take some time to reflect on what are our areas of vulnerability? What do we think in our journey as leading others? What do we think are our gaps in our knowledge? How comfortable are we with those? And how much of that are we prepared to share? And that might be through our support and our management, that we get the chance to say, actually, I'm feeling a little bit unsure about this aspect. So we're sharing our vulnerability. And the reason we do that is because we really feel it's an important part of being able to then act into the expected behaviours. So it's about how we trust the support or find the support to be able to really explore our vulnerability, so that we might be able to use that in some way to be able to take forward ourselves in our practice, but also support others. So the last point that she talks about is this bit about sharing our vulnerability purposefully. So we're really aware that where we have aspects of vulnerability, we are sharing that with a purpose in mind. It may well be that we want to use that as part of a reflection that brings us and connects us to our teams. So sometimes when we're going through difficulties or challenging times where there's a lot of change and flux, it may be that we might be struggling with that. We might find that difficult as well. And we may choose to share that vulnerability with our team, because that's helping them to understand that actually this is a shared experience. And that in leading them, through that, you recognise and understand the difficulties and the difficult emotions and the difficult feelings. Other times we may think, actually, because there is a vulnerability we're feeling, it may not be helpful to the team to know that we are feeling out of our depth. And that might be that we may not choose to share that completely, because it's important for the team to feel held, to feel contained. And actually, if we feel uncontained, it makes it more difficult. So this idea of sharing vulnerability purposefully is firstly understanding what are our vulnerabilities, what are the things that we're really struggling with, or where we feel we've got gaps. How might we seek support around that? So recognising and owning those, but then also choosing what's helpful in order to help others to act differently. So I hope that's making some sense to you, but I think it's quite useful. I wanted to share this because I find it a useful way of reflecting on, well, what do we mean when we think about our own leadership practice? What are we trying to achieve, and how do we use ourselves to try and, as we said earlier on in the presentation, to try and galvanise others to act, or to bring about different behaviours in other people. So let's talk a little bit more about ourselves and our awareness to self. So this is really thinking about, leading on from that, what do we bring? What do I bring to my leadership role? What is the aspect of me that I'm really interested in exploring? And this is a question of really thinking about our identity and what do we bring to our leadership role. There is something that I think we often, and it's hard when you haven't got the headspace and you're full and you're busy, but when we're starting to create that space to think about our leadership practice, what's the story of yourself as a leader and an agent of change? So I'm going to just connect you to some of the systemic thinking and postmodern theory, suggests that actually this story of ourself, and the one that we hold, really is constructed and built around and reflects our kind of cultural experience, our social context, our familial experience of the family we grew up in, and our own experience from childhood. It could be gendered, and educational experiences all go into shaping this narrative we hold of ourselves. And when it comes to leading people, it will be all those contexts that are informing how we see ourselves as a leader, and our sense of what we think our role can be as an agent of change. So one of the things it invites us to do, if we think within that paradigm, is that actually, if we're trying to interrogate to understand who we are and ourselves, then really we want to be curious about our own beliefs and our emotions. How do we understand that? Where do our beliefs come from? What is it in our cultural, social, familial context that really shapes our beliefs about ourselves, about what it means to be a leader, but also about the people we lead? And how all those stories we hold of self and the way in which we embody those do show themselves in the language we use. We think about our conversational and our listening style, and that can be broken down into our mannerisms, our tones, and our gestures. And so it's important to start to unpack or get a sense of understanding for ourselves about, where do these ideas of self come from? What about those ideas of self are really informing who we are? And so we've got to, when we think about that, when we think about the ideas that are drawn from our wider context, we really need to think, particularly when we think about cultural, social, political contexts, the things that inform who we are as people, then there is something about we need to understand the impact of power and the dynamics of power. What are the things that inform in who we are, that allow us to feel powerful? And that might show itself in our professional life, our sense of identity, but also that might be recognising the fact that actually when it comes to issues of power and how powerful we feel, from a sort of postmodern paradigm, we might think actually power is something that is enabled and maintained between people. And so recognising that, there may be things that suggest that actually power is a movable feast. It's not something that's static. And there are times when, if you're thinking about yourself in a leadership role, that you might feel more powerful than less powerful. What is contributing to that? You may have a story of self that sits in your personal life that you feel very different about yourself than when you do in your professional life. So really this beginning to start to think about ourselves is about how we start to really recognise who we are as a person, and where does those ideas of self come from? Because they are the things that we bring into our leadership. They are the things that inform how we engage and interact and how we make sense of our interaction with other people, particularly in the leadership context. And I'm wondering, thinking of that story of self, I'm quite curious for you, what you think might be some of the most, when you think about the influences in terms of your own style or your own sense of self, what do you think are some of the most powerful things, powerful influences that you have on you? You might say actually could come from your family context in terms of story of parenting or being parented. It could be something else. But I'm just curious for you to have a think for a few seconds just about where do you think your most important personal influences have come from? Because they are the things that you're bringing into the story of yourself as a leader and an agent of change. And so I'll leave you to have a bit of a think about that, and feel free to share if you want to share. But with some of this, you may want to reflect quietly to yourself and hold some of the things in mind. Throughout all of this, I'm inviting you just to do some real personal reflection on this. So you don't have to share it as part of the interaction we're having now, but just invite you to have a think about that. Because sometimes if we're curious about those things, we can start to understand what our motivations and what we're bringing to the role. So we start to think about those aspects of self that really do come to the fore when we're thinking about our leadership practice. So what are the things that motivate you? What motivates you? What keeps you engaged, interested? What do you feel passionate about? They are some of the things that really will either connect with the context in which you're leading people now, or you might find that actually sometimes some of the challenges we have and the struggles you have are because there's not enough of a connection with the personal motivations that you have. What are your values? How do you come to understand the things that are most important to you? And how do the values connect with the values of those within your team, the values of the organisation? So sometimes when we are thinking about what our leadership fit is, we have to kind of slow down a bit and sometimes take some time to sort of think, well, what do I hold dear? What are the values that are informing how I operate as a person, how I operate in my professional context, and what's the connection between those things, and what are the things that perhaps maybe need some exploration? And sometimes when we're thinking about how we use ourselves in leadership, it's about making some space to explore with our teams or members of our teams where we may be coming from different places about the values. So it's about how you might slow down sometimes, create some space. To be able to have, that could be a session, it could be using some of your reflective team space to think about values, revisit those. It might be some time before you've had to think about it, but just re-energizing this idea that actually how do we come to understand ourselves in relation to other people? And I suppose if you're modelling reflective practice, it's how reflective you can be as a leader around that, and how do you then bring that into your work with others? So within that, we think about our strengths, we think about our weaknesses, going back to the vulnerability. What do we know about those? How do we understand those? How do we take the risk to really check in with ourselves, what we might be struggling with, but at the same time really dialing up what we think we're good at? And then what might be the behaviours that we tend to fall onto? What are our default behaviours? What are the things that we tend to be our go-to practices? So this is about an invitation to interrogate what we bring and understand it from a self point of view. Because part of this is thinking, once we know ourselves, we can think about how our interaction with other people starts to move forward. Or we might be just curious to explore that a bit more if we really wanted to dial up some of our leadership practice. So yeah, as I said, it's quite interesting that, people are talking about the most important personal influence is about your own beliefs. And that's such a powerful thing. And going back to what I've shared before, it's the idea that, so if we think our own beliefs are the most influential thing, then where do those come from? How much of those are rooted in our culture, in our political context, in our familial story? So really interrogating and understanding, where do our beliefs come from? And some of those would be shaped by our experience to date. So you'll be bringing in all of that to how you make sense of your interactions with other people, but how you make sense of the role as a leader as well. So really what we're talking about is understanding who we are and really being curious about the story of the other. Because actually, when we're trying to bring out the best in other people, sometimes we have to know ourselves enough to recognise the things that might be inhibiting us, that might be shaping the lens in which we read and understand of the others that we're interacting with. But also, it invites us to start to think about, well, if we've got all this story of self going on, what is the story of self of the other person? So really, it's really starting to think about our story of self and our interaction, the story of self of other people. There's something how we think about how they influence how we construct our relationships together, but also how do they give meaning to our communication with each other. There's something about how we try to understand more about the other in order to recognise that how do we make meaning together? How do we understand each other? So when we're starting to think about how we use ourselves as a leader to influence and galvanise other people, one of the checks and balances we can think about is how well do we know the other? What do we need to understand about them? How do we check out that we are understanding each other when it comes to making meaning and when we think about our communication together? And that whole business of making meaning and communicating together is about us building really effective, strong relationships. So it invites us to always be quite curious and reflective about what happened in that interaction. Is there a curiosity I need to share because I'm not sure I'm understanding where someone else is coming from? And so it's about that standing in that curious stance as a leader to really recognise the story of the other, but also to start to think about how our story is influenced and how we hear that and how we make sense of it. And this can really be something we do on an unconscious level. So really how we understand and make sense and how we communicate with others is really going to be a mixture of the conscious and unconscious. So really thinking about, and I suppose when we try to inject some reflective practice into that, it's trying to think about what might be the thoughts and feelings that I'm not attending to. What might be influencing how I'm tapping into the story of other that I may not really be conscious of on a day-to-day or actively conscious of. And it's the idea that sometimes when we think about our communication, we really need to recognise that our communication will always be informed and shaped by perhaps thoughts and feelings that we might not be consciously aware of. So therefore, if we haven't thought about that, it may shape how we are positioning the other person. Because of the outward expression of our communication, it may also shape how they position us. And I think positioning becomes quite a powerful dynamic when it comes to leading and leadership. That we really need to think about in that interchange, in that exchange, how am I positioning myself and how am I being positioned by the other? So this kind of being reflective and reflexive in the moment is really starting to interrogate what we think might be happening in that communication. But also when we think more generally about our leadership stance, there is something about how we understand our relationship with others and the colleagues we work with in relation to positioning. And it may be that there might be some really dominant stories present in the organisation or present in the service or present within our teams that really shape how we think we are being positioned or how others position us. And some of those dominant discourses, if we think, again, taking you into much more of a sort of social constructionist paradigm within a systemic world, we're thinking about discourses that might be around gender, they could be around race, they could be around class, they could be around sexuality. And sometimes if we recognise these discourses, it's about how we then start to undermine any negative impact they may have in terms of how we are positioned or how communication works. And I think it's about being able to sort of stay with the space and think about curiosity and being curious about what is being understood, how am I making sense of this person, and what is it that might be in terms of any dominant discourses that might be shaping the lens in which I'm viewing this person, or I think I'm being viewed, or that might be shaping how I'm hearing information. What is organising us when we are stepping in and standing in that leadership space? So there's something about our view of ourselves and others, which you may find this useful to think about, and I suppose it's no different to many different schools of thought, but this idea that actually we're always holding these internal maps and scripts. These are, these ways of, we have templates that make it easier for us to process information, but in a sense, this idea of self and our sense of what we think we look like and behave like and want to be like as a leader will be informed by this internal map or script. And that could come from a bit of a combination of professional and personal script, but it becomes a framework in which we hold ourselves and the framework in which we make sense of other people. And so it's just recognising that actually we have to think a bit more about what might be the scripts that we're leaning back on, what might be the script of leadership, or this internal map of what it is to be a leader that we fall on as our template or way of working. And I think, inviting you to think about that, you may feel that actually some of the scripts that you have or some of the templates are really powerful and useful. And I think in all of this, it's important to really reflect on the things that are useful and where you feel that practice is good, or where you feel you've been able to really have an impact on other people positively. Similarly, I think it's an opportunity to reflect on what might be the scripts that are less helpful, and when are the occasions where they may not be useful in bringing about change or positive change. And so there's something about how we interrogate or start to observe in ourselves, what are our go-to ways of being? What are our templates and where do they come from? One of the things that we can always start to do is start to deconstruct those templates if we think they're not helpful. But firstly, we need to recognise what they are. And so you may have, as I'm talking, you may have some sense in your mind as to what your templates are, or you might not. And going back to what we reflected on earlier, some of your templates or maps of self, and particularly if you think of yourself as a leader, may come from, I mentioned earlier on that we sometimes hold an idea that's based on our experience of being led. So you may have a template or map or script that's really been shaped by someone else who's led you, or you've seen examples of leadership, you think, oh, this is fabulous. I really would like to imagine myself acting into a leadership role like that. So there's something about how we match those two things and reflect on what we hold as our internal script or map of self and how we use that on a day-to-day basis, and really think about the helpfulness of some aspects of it and maybe areas that we think, are they yet that helpful, and how can I think differently about those elements that may need to change or be thought about differently. I'm just going to share this with you quickly because I think it's a really useful framework to think about. And this is the somebody called Alexander Calais developed this as a framework to think about how we think. It's a really useful one because it's rooted in this idea that actually thinking, well, I suppose our conscious and unconscious thought are the things that really underpin how we feel and therefore shape our actions. which then go and lead to the results that we find. And I suppose this is a framework that I suppose invites you to think about or interrogate some of your pathway. So what is it that what are your thoughts that you're holding that then inform the feelings that you have, that then shape the actions and the results that then occur? I mean, this is rooted in thinking about leadership and thinking about leadership practice. And I suppose what it suggests is that it talks about the fact that often we will have, going back to our kind of scripts and maps that I just mentioned, often there will be thought habits, so units of thoughts, beliefs, perceptions, assumptions, units of knowledge that you'll be drawing on routinely on a day-to-day basis. And it's these thoughts, habits, and they become habits because you draw on them all the time. Going back to this whole script thing, you draw on them all the time. And they are things that, because our brain likes to be quite efficient and it's much easier for us to draw on those things, that they become an embedded part of how we think about a situation. And that actually, in the moment, when we're drawing on these thoughts, habits, that combined with how we feel, really create what we perceive to be the reality of our situation. So if you imagine you may have a situation within your leadership context or an issue or challenge, and I suppose we're thinking within this framework, the idea is that you are approaching it and you have thoughts about it that are drawn from your thought habits. They are the things that combine with how you feel, which give you a sense of the reality of that issue and the challenge that you're facing. And I suppose the challenge within this framework and what he suggests is that actually that reality that you experience, so the stuckness you may feel or the challenge with that situation or the issue, can be a subjective reality. And so because it's informing, they're your own thought habits and they're your own experience of feelings. So they may be a very subjective reality that might not really be connected to the objective situation. So this idea that actually our lens and our experience and our own thoughts will really be shaping how we perceive the reality of that situation. But he argues that actually maybe there may be a difference between our subjective reality and the objective situation. And I suppose what this approach suggests is that actually when we approach a particular situation or stuckness, we have the opportunity to really interrogate what the thoughts are in order to understand how they were shaping how we feel. And then we can start to subvert the actions and the results. I suppose to think about it, to really engage with this idea, you have to kind of believe in the idea of that what we think comes before what we feel. There's a lot of debate about that, whether that's actually the case. But I think it's an interesting way to think about how do we start to subvert what might be a pathway that leads to actions and results that we may or may not want. And I suppose I'm sharing it with you because I think it's a way of starting to think about how might you interrogate what your thoughts are around a particular issue or situation. How do you feel about that? What kind of feelings is it generating in you? And then subsequently, what actions has that produced? And what result has that meant? And so what you start to do is think, actually, what are my alternate results that I'm looking for? So what thoughts would you want to have if the situation could be different? What feelings do you think that would generate? And therefore, what alternate actions could be taken and what results? So it's a way of slowly moving from a place of starting to unpack and deconstruct thought patterns or as he calls them, thought habits that may not be leading to the kind of actions and results that you're looking for, and using this as a flow to be able to sort of think, well, hold on, if I could imagine or if I could picture my alternate pathway, what would that mean in terms of my thinking? And what would that mean? What do I believe that would generate? So it's a way of starting to use a frame, I suppose, to be able to really interrogate those aspects of how we think. I thought I'd share that because I think it's a useful way of, another way, I suppose there's a range of ways, but one way of starting to use a framework to unpack how we might be thinking and feeling. And as I said, it's this idea of being able to really connect into What might we be holding as our internal scripts or maps, or as Calais says, our thought habits, particularly where we think they may not be leading to a result that we're looking for. So what I've started to introduce, and I'm aware that I'm packing loads of information in, so do capture anything that you think might be you'd like to touch on again, or you feel that has gone too quickly. And I'll sort of in a moment reflect a bit on any kind of feedback that's been coming through. But really what I'm starting to unpack with you and think about is when we think about ourselves and we start to understand ourselves as leaders, there is a process of really starting to interrogate who we are and what we bring. And that's certainly what we've started to reflect on in terms of our awareness of self and what we bring to it, the story of self that we bring to our leadership role. But I suppose touching on that thinking path approach, so what do we do with that? How do we recognise the impact it might be having? And so it's something that you will all be familiar with when we talk about reflective practice. And I suppose that's about thinking about the ways in which we consider not just what happened. I quite like this quote, so I'm sharing it with you, but also our responses to what happened so that we can learn in a way that avoids replicating past mistakes. So we're talking about an opportunity to look back at situations and really think about what our responses have been and what might be our learning points within that. So we're starting to think in a leadership, and that could be reflecting on an interaction we've had with a member of staff. It could be something that we're challenged with in terms of looking at the whole team, or any interaction we might have had with our peers or other colleagues. But really getting into the mode of reflecting on what a situation has presented for us. What was our impact on other people? What was their impact on us? What was our response to the situation? So thinking of all that I've talked about before, what is it that we need to attend to in terms of our responses to those situations? So, I'm well aware that actually when we think about reflective practice, you'll be really familiar with that, and certainly you'll be supporting others to be reflective in their practice. I suppose what I'm pushing you to think about is actually when we think about leadership practice, I would argue that it's fundamental to knowing who we are, how we use ourselves and what we bring, and how we can be as impactful as possible. So the practice of reflection, and I'd mention it as a practice because I think it's something that we sometimes need to keep doing to be able, I don't think we ever easily reach a stage where we are all practiced out. I think there's so many different scenarios that can be presented that require us to really reflect on what's happened and what our response to it has been. So I see it as an ongoing way of being, but it does invite us to think about our impact on other people and how we've experienced the situation so we can shape our behaviours and actions going forward. And one thing I would say is not always looking at things that have been difficult or have gone wrong. It can also be about reflecting on things that have gone well so we can learn more from that and do more of that. So I really invite you to think when we're talking about situations that we want to reflect on, it's not just things that have challenged us or we found tricky or difficult. It's also things that we think have gone really well. And I think in the busyness of our day-to-day lives and your busyness of your leadership, it can be really difficult to really pick up on those moments that have gone well. It's almost as though, because of the nature of what you do and the nature of how you're working, we zoom in quite readily on things that haven't gone well, or we really remember and resonate with things that have been difficult or felt quite emotionally hard. And so sometimes in order to really think about being reflective in its entirety, is how do we dial up the opportunity to be able to think about positive learning experience? Notice those situations where they've gone really well. Notice where we feel we've been able to use ourselves really effectively. So I suppose it invites you to do a bit more self-observation and really tap into the data and information that you may miss, because often we are looking for things that have gone wrong. At the same time, it's really starting to think about the more we can be self-reflective, we start to think about and understand how we operate. And so it is really drawing on all of that information and intelligence we have about ourselves and thinking about our impact and have it as an iterative process. So we're constantly learning, constantly shaping and reflecting. One of the challenges I recognise is making the space to do that. But I would argue that actually that's one of the things that we really need to think about. And so these are just a few questions I think you can really think about for yourself. So really, when you're thinking of being reflective and more reflective in your practice, so what are, as well as thinking of the you, as a leader, what attitudes, behaviours and performance are you seeking? What is it you're looking for in other people? What kind of actions are you looking for people to take? Just so that you're able to get more of a sense of what is it in others that you're seeking? What tells you that the direction of travel or things have gone well? So really asking yourselves a bit more about that. How are you paying attention to difference? So what I think I mentioned before, that actually we will all have a story of self that we bring. We will all have different experiences, different journeys that have taken you there. So immediately we are trying to pay attention to the differences amongst people, but also there will be difference around some of the dominant discourses, which might be, as again I said, about race, class, gender, sexuality. How much in a leadership space are you recognising and paying attention to difference? How curious are you about the story of other? The lived experience of other people, the lens with which they might perceive and experience being in your service or team, but also making meaning between people. So there's something about how we stay curious and we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, share what we don't know, and are able to really to bring that to bear. So using ourselves to say, actually, I'm okay with recognising that I don't know everything about your lived experience or how you're understanding the conversation we're having now. So really paying attention to difference so that it's recognised that difference is something that allows us to really recognise and understand the other person. So going back to the understanding the other, really. And then finally, what's as an agent of change, and I say this because I think it's quite an important part of leadership, that often, and most of you will be, leading teams, services towards goals that are about change. And when you're leading others, I'm always curious about, what's your theory of change? What's your idea of the possibility of change? What is it that you hold in your mind and your frame, which will stick, that will be part of your internal map? What ideas about change do you have? What possibilities do you have to allow the scope for people to change their behaviours, attitudes and cultures? Those will make a difference, because I think if we stay in a space of possibilities, it can allow us to choose to behave in particular ways. So sometimes in terms of our reflective practice, recognising what do we believe our held theory of change is, and how does that fit with how we then practice that with other people. When we think about reflection and reflective practice, the other aspects is really thinking about reflexive practice. So this is where we are in the moment, so for example, I talked about reflective practice of being able to look back at situations and really learn from them and look at what our responses were. A reflective approach is really about where we're able to be much more in the moment, use the information that's coming from other people to be able to shape our responses. So it's a bit more dynamic, a bit more kind of in the moment. And I'm sure some of you will be aware of reflexivity. If not, that's essentially what we're talking about. The kind of in the moment, being much more aware and dialing up that awareness. So thinking about in your leadership practice, what do you want to deepen or change or learn about? In order to really dial up your reflexive and your reflective practice, you have to have a sense of what you think you want to learn more about yourself. You have to have an idea of what practice, going back to what works well, what do you want to deepen and really embed, or what do you think needs to change? So you need to go into it with the idea about what that is. And then you start to get into the art of noticing. So once you've consciously identified what you think you want to improve or change or shift, then it's something about how you start to develop the art of noticing. So it might be thinking about your responses. So really, how do you notice your response to a situation? If you're aware of something that challenges or organises you, if you're aware about your response to a particular situation, how do you then go forward and start to notice it a bit more? So what might be the responses that you tend to make? Are there scripted behaviours that you're using? What might be the patterns? So what are the circumstances that lead you to behave in that way? And what's your almost go-to response? So sometimes we will have patterns that we fall back on, and there may be triggers to that. So there's something about the art of noticing that invites you to really think about and observe yourself. It may be that some of that noticing, you can be helped with that because you might be thinking about who else can help me in this art of noticing. So you may be quite good at recognising or almost being a bit meta to yourself in meetings or in one-to-ones or in supervisions or a range of scenarios where you actively think, right, I'm going to really see what happens for me. Also, you might be inviting others to notice because it allows you to build that information and that sort of data and intelligence about yourself and your responses in order for you to be able to think about, again, what you need to deepen, change or learn. So as I mentioned, self-observation really is a way of increasing your awareness of your internal processes and any external actions. And they allow you to then, once you have a greater sense of those things, you can really start to think about your strategies. There may be things that you think are more and I don't mean this in a generally try and change everything, but it's about if you can go for the process of working out what you notice, trying to really focus down on what you think are helpful and in helpful situations, then you might then try to think of strategies to try and manage those responses. So looking at what the triggers may be, seeing if you can subvert those, or alerting others if they can support you with that. But you might be finding ways to mitigate your own response. But I think, as I said before, it can also be about those helpful things. So noticing things that work well so that your strategy might be, I'm going to bring this more into this space. So you start to use them more. And that's all about starting to feel that you, in developing your leadership practice, you're able to really learn from your own experiences. You can build new templates that you can draw on, but also you can have much more in your toolkit when it comes to dealing with new situations. So the more that you practice and rehearse new ways of responding, they become more of your template, they become more of your script for a particular situation. And so there is something about how you have the space to slow down. If there's a particular thing that you think is a challenge for you when you're leading others, you might want to focus down, spend a bit of time working out what might be the triggers, the patterns, the responses, what's happening in this scenario. Do a bit of self-observation to start to then work out what are the aspects around that scenario that can be changed or thought of differently. So it's an invitation to start to think about how you might capture that. And everybody's different. Some people find it useful to, if you're starting to move into this space, some people like to journal or note to themselves. Some people like to draw on other people. And it could be your line manager, it could be other trusted people who help give you a bit of a window to yourself so that you can start to get that feedback, which is more data that you can use to start to think about your practice. I suppose this is just really emphasising the fact that actually when we're thinking of reflective practice is powerful and it allows us to gather data and understand ourselves in our leadership role and how we function. But also a stretch. So when we move from that to reflexive, which is we're being much more aware in the moment and we're trying to determine different ways of responding in the moment, that's more of a stretch. That's a bit more dynamic. And so really, when we're trying to be reflexive, we're taking that stretch from where we might be looking back and learning about a scenario to really trying to think in the moment, what is going on for us? What's happening between us and other people? What kind of actions are we taking, or do we need to change course during that moment? It's quite a challenge, and I'm not saying it's easy to readily do that, but I suppose the invitation here is to say, actually, in all of this, you're paying attention to what's informing your responses and your actions. You're paying attention to how you are performing into your leadership role in a very dynamic way. You're thinking about the influences which come from your ideas and your beliefs and your way of being yourself, but you're also tracking how they were influencing in that interaction with other people. And it's that moment where you may think about, how might I respond in this situation? What is it in terms of triggers or situations that are doing something to me, and why is that? But you also may be trying to think about the other within that reflexive moment. So, what is how are they responding to you? And what do you understand about their narrative and their story, which means that you can, rather than maybe get into stuck patterns, you're paying attention to that. So you may change a course of action just to make sure you can have a very different type of interaction. I'm not saying it's an easy thing to do, but I think it's an invitation to start to think about how we can start to really stretch ourselves from beyond reflective to being really reflexive and really tracking the influence that we have with the approaches that we take. And so just finally thinking about that. So it really helps us to understand a self-reflexive stance, helps us to try to think about how we operate within a system. And just to break it down, it's really thinking about what's the effect of my behaviour, posture, tone, question or comment in this moment. And if we are paying attention, if there's a particular aspect of your practice or impact that you really want to focus down on, you may really narrow down on a particular thing. You might think about your tone of voice. You might be thinking about the kind of interaction, so it could be the question or comment or something that you say. You might really hold on to, I've said this, so what impact has it just had? And if the response that you get back isn't what you need or isn't helpful to move in the situation on, the reflectiveness will be about how do you then change direction or change course in order to keep the possibility of communication going. So there's something about how we practice the stance, that we are constantly in this mode, I would say, of really starting to think about how we are using ourselves, what we bring, what's informing our lens and how we even understand the situation, but also being open enough to be able to share our naivety, being open enough to be able to share our curiosity. So sometimes we might be curious about why somebody's responded the way they have. We might be curious about what people's understanding and perception of what we've said or done is. Sometimes when we're busy, we don't really slow down enough to do that. So I suppose a self-reflexive stance invites us to take those sorts of risks and to think a bit more about how are we able in our leadership capacity to really take the chance to share what we might be naive about. How do we share our seeking to understand the other so that we can think of the best way to support another person to perform at their best? And I think the challenge is often moving between all those positions where we are thinking about ourselves, thinking about the other, but also in holding in our mind, what are we trying to achieve here in a leadership capacity? So I think essentially, I think certainly in terms of some of the comments that have had, they're really about emphasising what I've shared already, which is really thinking about the context that you work in, really. So there's a comment really thinking about power and how it changes who we are and which situations we're in. I'm curious about whether any of this, has been able to help you think about where you want to go next, really, in developing your leadership practice. But I think certainly what's always seems to come up is a real challenge around how do we stay in a reflexive stance, given the pressures that you face on a day-to-day basis. And I think one of the things I wouldn't assume is possible easily is the ability to carve out those spaces to be able to think about your practice. But I think it's something that we should aspire to, and certainly take the opportunity to think about how do we start to learn more about our impact and what we bring to our practice of leadership. So I just wondered, before we kind of finish, are there any questions that people have? Is there anything that people want to ask? I feel conscious that there's a lot of, I've kind of shared a lot of ideas in a short space of time. And it's fine if you don't have any questions for now. If you feel there's anything that I've covered that you want to get in touch with me about and talk a bit more about, then the details are on the slide. Seems like I left you with a lot to think about. So I've really enjoyed having the opportunity to talk with you today. And hopefully, as I said, if there are any thoughts and questions that you have, feel free to just send them through, and we can end that there. So thanks for being with me this morning, and I wish you an enjoyable rest of the day.